Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Rain was pouring down on the tinted windows of the limousine. Jonathan Miller, an elegant man in his 50s but with a face marked by hardship, stared at the horizon without really seeing it. 3 years had passed since the sudden death of his wife, Sarah, in a car accident. Since that day, his heart had not beaten with the same force. He, the feared businessman, the respected multimillionaire, was nothing more than a shadow, imprisoned by his own success. He had everything, except the essentials, the love and warmth of a home. His only reason for living was his 3-year-old daughter, Emily. But even with her, Jonathan often felt clumsy. Too preoccupied with his own affairs, he relied on nannies and babysitters to fill in for the absences. Deep down, a lingering guilt gnawed at him. He knew he wasn't the hands-on father Sarah would have wanted him to be. That evening, exhausted by an interminable meeting, he decided to dine at a modest restaurant downtown, far from the luxurious establishments he usually frequented. Emily, left under the watchful eye of a young student he had hired, accompanied him. However, barely had he settled in when Jonathan received an urgent call from his lawyer and became absorbed in a tense conversation. Meanwhile, Emily, hungry and neglected, began to cry quietly. That's when she came into his life. A waitress, barely 30, her features tired but lit by a sincere smile, approached. Without hesitation, she took a teaspoon and knelt beside Emily. Her gestures were gentle, precise, imbued with maternal tenderness. She spoke to the girl in simple words, her soothing voice contrasting with the hubbub of the restaurant. Little by little, Emily calmed down, gripping the waitress's fingers as if she had known her forever. Jonathan, finally looking up from his phone, was petrified. He watched the scene as if contemplating a fragment of his past life, his late wife. The waitress's gestures strangely reminded him of Sarah, the protective and loving way she had with their daughter. A shiver ran through his body. What he saw that evening turned his life upside down. Because in this unknown waitress, he perceived something that all his money, all his businesses and all his power could not offer him, authentic human warmth, the kind that heals the deepest wounds. And without knowing it, this meeting would forever change the destiny of Jonathan, Emily, and that woman with the coffee-stained apron. The restaurant was called the Maple Diner, a small, family-run establishment located on the corner of a busy street. The walls still smelled of freshly brewed coffee, and the red and white checkered tablecloths recalled a simpler time. It was a far cry from the Michelin-starred restaurants where Jonathan Miller usually sat, but on this night, fate had led him to this modest place. The young woman who had fostered Emily was Grace Parker. 28 years old, she had worked as a waitress for over 5 years. Her life had never been easy, abandoned by her father at an early age, raised by an ailing mother who eventually died of cancer. She had learned to fend for herself. Yet, despite the hardships, Grace had never lost that natural sweetness that emanated from her. Her colleagues often said that she had a mother's heart, even though she had no children of her own. That evening, she had noticed Emily almost immediately. The little girl, sitting in her high chair, was struggling to get attention. Her clear eyes were misty with tears, and her stomach was rumbling with hunger. The babysitter, a distracted teenager, was too absorbed in her phone to react. Grace felt a familiar pang at the sight. It reminded her of her own past, when she too had known hunger and the feeling of being invisible. Without thinking, she approached. She spoke softly to Emily, as if they had known each other forever. "Hello, princess, you're hungry, aren't you?" The little girl immediately grabbed her finger, and Grace, touched by the innocent gesture, took a spoon and began to feed her. The tears turned into stifled giggles. A few meters away, Jonathan Miller raised his head. His tired eyes met Grace's. A strange silence fell over him, as if time had stood still. There was something in that gaze, a sincerity, a raw kindness he hadn't encountered since Sarah's death. For a moment, Jonathan forgot everything, his status, his business, his millions. He saw only a waitress in an apron, kneeling before her daughter, feeding her with the tenderness of a mother. And this simple gesture, banal for others, resonated in him like a painful reminder, but also like a promise of hope. Jonathan Miller remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Emily was laughing now, her small hands clapping playfully against the table, while Grace spoke to her softly, as if she had always been part of their world. Jonathan, who wasn't one to let his emotions show, felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't felt that way in years. Finally, he took a breath, stood up, and walked over. "Excuse me," he said in a deep, almost hesitant voice. Grace jumped slightly. She looked up and saw the man she'd noticed when she'd entered, a perfectly tailored suit, a luxurious watch on his wrist, and carefully styled salt and pepper hair. Everything about him exuded success, but also a strange loneliness. "Oh. I'm sorry," she replied, getting up quickly. "I didn't mean to. I mean, she was hungry, and the girl who's looking after her was busy." She glared accusingly at the babysitter, still engrossed in her phone, completely uninterested in what was going on. Jonathan followed her gaze, then back to Grace. He shook his head gently. "No, don't apologize. On the contrary. I think I should thank you." He turned to Emily, who was staring at him with a bright smile, her mouth still full. "It's been a long time since I've seen her so happy," he murmured, almost to himself. Grace felt her heart clench. This powerful man, who seemed to have everything going for him, suddenly seemed vulnerable. She hesitated, then dared to ask. "Is she your daughter?" "Yes. Emily," Jonathan replied with pride mixed with sadness. "Her mother is." He paused for a second, his throat tight. "She's no longer here." A heavy silence fell between them. Grace instinctively placed a light hand on the man's shoulder. "I'm sorry, really." Jonathan looked at her, surprised by this simple and sincere gesture. Few people dared to touch him, let alone speak to him with such gentleness. Usually, he was approached with respect, fear, or interest. But this woman, a simple waitress, clearly didn't see the millionaire. She just saw a father, a wounded man. It was the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. "My name is Grace," she finally said with a small, shy smile. Jonathan answered in a low but clear voice. "Jonathan." And in this simple exchange of first names, something was born, without either of them yet understanding it. Jonathan returned to his table, but his thoughts remained fixed on the waitress with her sincere gaze. Emily, however, still held out her small hands toward Grace, as if refusing to let her go. This gesture deeply touched Jonathan, who had never seen his daughter show so much affection for a stranger. Grace, clearly accustomed to working under pressure, resumed her shift with agility. She moved from table to table, smiling despite the signs of fatigue visible on her face. Her worn shoes slipped on the tiled floor, her hands bore the marks of long hours of labor, but she didn't complain. Each customer received a kind word from her, a special touch of attention. Jonathan, who had spent his life in the coldest business circles, was fascinated by this human warmth. He watched as Grace brought a slice of pie to a lonely old man, taking the time to ask how he was doing. He saw her comfort a little girl who had spilled her glass of juice, offering her a new one without charging her parents. Everything about her exuded a rare, almost disarming kindness. At one point, Grace stood behind the counter for a second, rubbing her temples wearily. Jonathan noticed details that someone else would have missed, the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, and the quiet sigh she let out before continuing her rounds as if nothing had happened. He felt a strange curiosity invade him. Who was this woman, willing to give so much without expecting anything in return? Why this melancholic look that contrasted with her luminous smile? Emily, for her part, never took her eyes off Grace. Every time she passed by the table, the girl burst out laughing, which even brought a genuine smile from Jonathan, a smile he hadn't shown in a long time. When Grace came back to drop off the bill, Jonathan couldn't help but ask her. "You seem very good with children. Do you have any?" Grace gave a bitter chuckle and shook her head. "No. Not yet," Life hasn't given me that chance. Her gaze clouded for a moment, but she quickly recovered with a forced smile. Jonathan felt a surge of emotion wash over him. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability in people. He then understood that this waitress, whom he had met by chance, aroused in him an interest that he had never felt for any other since the death of his wife. And that was just the beginning. The Maple Diner was beginning to fill up. Families were settling in, workers were coming in for a hot meal, and the sound of conversation mingled with the clinking of cutlery. Jonathan, still seated, watched Emily, who, despite her young age, seemed fascinated by the commotion. But his eyes kept returning to Grace. As she carried a heavy tray laden with steaming plates, an argument broke out at a neighboring table. A man, visibly irritated, stood up abruptly and bumped Grace with his shoulder. The tray wobbled dangerously. A few seconds of imbalance were enough for a plate to slide off and shatter on the floor with a crash that silenced the entire restaurant. "Be careful, damn it," the man said arrogantly, as if it were the waitress's fault. Grace blushed with embarrassment, lowering her head. Her hands trembled slightly, but she said nothing. She crouched down to pick up the pieces, her knees hitting the cold tiles. No one moved, except Jonathan. He stood up, placed Emily on her high chair, and strode firmly across the room. All eyes turned to him. Without a word, he crouched down beside Grace and helped her pick up the china. The silence grew heavier. The arrogant customer watched, disconcerted. He realized that this distinguished man, who looked so obviously wealthy, had no qualms about getting down on his knees to support a simple waitress. "It wasn't your fault," Jonathan said calmly to Grace, picking up the debris. She looked at him, stunned, her eyes shining with an emotion she was trying to hide. "Thank you," she murmured. "Few people would have done that." Jonathan gave a half-smile. Few people know how to recognize when a person deserves respect. The man who had caused the incident, flushed with embarrassment, mumbled a clumsy apology before hastily leaving the restaurant. The customers exchanged surprised glances, some whispering about the unusual scene. When everything was cleaned up, Grace stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. Jonathan stood up as well, and their eyes met again. In her eyes, he read genuine gratitude, but also a newfound curiosity. In his own, there was a growing admiration he couldn't explain. Emily clapped abruptly, breaking the tension. Her small voice echoed, "Bravo!" The whole restaurant burst into tender laughter. Grace, her cheeks slightly red, bowed theatrically towards the girl. "Thank you, Princess." Jonathan knew at that moment that he wanted to know more about this woman who, in one evening, had already turned his world upside down. After the incident, Jonathan sat for a long time, his gaze following Grace wherever she went. She tried to keep smiling, but he could see the fatigue in her movements and the veil of sadness that sometimes crossed her eyes when she thought no one was watching. When the bustle of the restaurant calmed down a little, Jonathan seized the opportunity. He raised his hand to get her attention. Grace approached, holding her order pad. "Do you want anything else?" she asked politely. Jonathan hesitated for a second, then replied, "Just a coffee. And maybe a few minutes of your time, if that's not too much to ask." Grace raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised by the unusual request. She wasn't used to a customer simply wanting to talk to her, especially one wearing a watch that was surely worth more than she earned in a year. But Jonathan's gaze wasn't arrogant or domineering. There was sincerity. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming cup of coffee and sat down across from him, hesitant. Emily, delighted, clapped her hands and reached out to her. Grace took the girl's tiny hand, making Jonathan smile. "Have you been working here long?" he asked to break the ice. 5 years, she replied simply. It wasn't really a choice, but rather a necessity. She looked down, as if she already regretted saying too much. Jonathan let her breathe for a moment before continuing softly. "And outside of work? Do you have family?" Grace shook her head. "Not really. My mother died a few years ago. My father, let's just say he disappeared from my life a long time ago. So I'm on my own. Jonathan sensed a hint of pain in her voice. Despite her calm tone, he could sense the loneliness she was trying to mask behind her smile. It's not easy every day, she continued. But I'm hanging in there. I've learned that even when life gives you little, you can still give a lot to others. That's what keeps me going. Jonathan remained silent for a moment, struck by the strength of this woman who had lost everything but still found the courage to love, to smile, to give. He, with his colossal fortune, sometimes felt powerless in the face of his own loneliness. But she, with almost nothing, lit up an entire restaurant. Emily chattered happily as she tugged on Grace's sleeve. Jonathan watched the scene and found himself thinking, what if this meeting was not a coincidence? He took a sip of his coffee, then said softly, "You have more courage than many people I know, Grace." She blushed slightly, embarrassed by the unexpected compliment. "I do what I can." But in his heart, Jonathan already knew he wanted to discover more. And even more, that he wanted to see her again. As the evening wore on, the Maple Diner's customers slowly began to leave. The noise was dying down, leaving only a few muffled conversations and the clatter of cutlery behind the counter. Emily, tired but still clinging to Grace's sleeve, refused to let go. Jonathan, for his part, watched the scene with unusual tenderness. His heart had hardened since Sarah's death, but Grace's presence seemed to be slowly cracking the walls he had erected around himself. When Grace tried to get up to resume her shift, Emily immediately protested, her eyes filling with tears. Jonathan placed a soothing hand on the waitress's shoulder. "If you have to go back to work, at least let me pay the bill," he said calmly. "Anne, I'd like to ask you a favor." Grace frowned slightly, intrigued. "A favor?" Jonathan took a deep breath, searching for words. "Emily is growing fond of you, and to be honest, I haven't seen her smile this bright in a long time. You have that way with her. So I was wondering if you'd be willing to see her again." Grace remained silent for a moment, surprised by this proposal. "You mean, as a babysitter?" Jonathan gave a smile. "Yes. Or even just as a friendly presence. Someone you can trust." She looked down, hesitating. "I don't know. I work a lot of hours here. And besides, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this." "On the contrary," Jonathan replied gently. "You're exactly the right person." The sincere tone in his voice made Grace's heart beat faster than she expected. No one had said anything like that to her in a long time. Emily, as if to support her father's request, held out her arms and stammered, "Grace, stay." The waitress felt her eyes sting. She bit her lip, then nodded slowly. "Okay. I can try." Jonathan gave a relieved smile, almost imperceptible, but rare enough to be precious. He took out a silver business card engraved with his name, Jonathan Miller, Miller Enterprises. Grace stared at it in amazement. She realized then that he was no ordinary customer. "Here's my direct number," he said, handing her the card. "I don't give it to many people." Grace took it carefully, as if she was holding something fragile. And at that moment, without them fully realizing it, an invisible thread had just been woven between their lives. The next morning, Grace was tidying up her tiny one-room apartment, where every piece of furniture looked like it had outlived her. On the small, rickety table, the business card Jonathan had left her gleamed in the sunlight. She took it in her fingers and read it again, Jonathan Miller, Miller Enterprises. The name sounded familiar. Driven by curiosity, she turned on her old, half-cracked phone and typed the name into a search engine. Within seconds, the screen filled with articles, photos, and videos. Jonathan Miller, CEO of one of the country's largest investment groups. An empire built on real estate, finance, and technology. One of the richest men in New York. Grace's eyes widened. She remembered his watch, his impeccable suit, his natural confidence. It all made sense now. But his heart sank. Why would a man like him be interested in a simple waitress? She thought of Emily, of her radiant smile, and felt her doubts grow. Had she really touched the child, or simply a coincidence? And Jonathan, did he see her as a sincere person, or as a passing distraction in his lonely billionaire life? At the same time, across town, Jonathan sipped coffee in his vast office, perched atop a glass tower. But his mind wasn't on his files. He remembered Grace's gaze, her soft voice, and especially the way Emily had clung to her. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to step out of his golden bubble and reach out to someone outside his world. Grace, however, wasn't convinced. She remembered all those stories where the powerful played with the lives of others without regard for the consequences. She had suffered too much to let herself be manipulated. That evening, as she was preparing to leave for work, her gaze fell once again on the card. She slipped it into her bag with a sigh. "I don't know what I'm getting myself into," she murmured. What she didn't yet know was that this choice, this little silver card, would change her life much more than she could have imagined. A few days later, Grace received a call on her old phone. Jonathan's deep voice boomed through the crackling speaker. "Hello, Grace. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Emily keeps saying your name. She would be very happy to see you again." Grace's heart sank. She hesitated for a moment, then agreed. "Okay. When do you want me to come?" A few hours later, an elegant chauffeur in a black suit pulled up in front of her small, decrepit building in a luxury sedan. The neighbors watched the scene from their windows, astonished. Grace, uncomfortable in her simple dress and worn shoes, climbed into the car, already sensing the contrast. When the vehicle stopped in front of Jonathan's penthouse, her mouth was open. The huge windows reflected the city, and a doorman greeted her with a formal smile. Inside, everything exuded luxury: marble floors, expensive paintings, modern furniture. Emily immediately ran up, shouting, "Grace!" The little girl threw herself into his arms, and Grace embraced her with sincere tenderness. Jonathan, who was watching the scene from the living room, felt an unusual warmth invade his chest. "Welcome home," he said, approaching. Grace glanced around, impressed but also intimidated. "I don't think I've ever set foot in a place like this." Jonathan smiled. "It's just a house, Grace. It's what you live in, not what it's worth." She looked at him skeptically. To her, these walls represented an inaccessible world, a world that had never accepted her. During the afternoon, Grace played with Emily, making her laugh out loud. Jonathan sat in an armchair, watching them as if mesmerized. For the first time, his apartment seemed alive, filled with human warmth. But deep down, Grace couldn't shake her doubts. When Jonathan offered her a glass of wine, she replied softly, "I'm not sure I belong here, Jonathan. You and I, we come from two completely different worlds." He held her gaze, serious. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean our paths can't cross." She looked away, confused. She wanted to believe him, but a small voice whispered that a gap that wide could not be bridged so easily. And yet, Emily, snuggled up against her, seemed to be the invisible bridge that already connected them. A few days after that first visit, Jonathan invited Grace and Emily to lunch at a more upscale Manhattan restaurant. He wanted to show her that this wasn't just a one-time gesture, but that he truly wanted to include Grace and Emily in his life. Upon arriving, Grace immediately felt the difference. The tables were set with crisp tablecloths, the waiters impeccably dressed, and the customers wore elegant suits and dresses. She suddenly felt awkward in her simple dress and worn shoes. Emily held Grace's hand happily. Jonathan, trying to lighten the mood, whispered, "Don't worry, Grace. No one here is better or worse than you." But despite her reassuring words, the moment they were seated at their table, a couple at the next table couldn't help but give Grace a surprised and contemptuous look. The woman, a condescending smile on her lips, whispered to her companion, "Who is this, waitress's daughter? With him?" Grace felt her face burn. Emily squeezed her hand innocently, and Jonathan frowned. He stood up immediately and addressed the couple. "If you have a problem with who I hang out with or with my family, I advise you to leave." The restaurant fell silent. The couple, red with shame, stood up hastily, taking their arrogance with them. Grace, still shaken by the situation, whispered, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ruin your lunch." Jonathan looked at her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's not you. Don't blame yourself. Unfortunately, some people judge without knowing. But you have nothing to prove." For the first time, Grace felt a strange mixture of comfort and embarrassment. She knew that her simple, modest life contrasted sharply with Jonathan's luxurious world, and that she was still perceived as different in the eyes of some. Yet she also saw the admiration in his eyes, the steadfastness in wanting to protect and value her despite everything. This gesture, his instinctive defense, reinforced her attachment to him, while also giving rise to an inner conflict. Emily, oblivious to all the social weight, laughed happily as she pointed at the desserts on the menu. And Grace, looking at her, felt a new determination form in her heart. Maybe the outside world will never understand, she thought. But for Emily and for me, I want to try. After the exhausting lunch, Jonathan drove Grace and Emily to a small park not far from his apartment. The children played on the swings and slides, laughing their heads off, while Grace and Jonathan sat on a bench, watching Emily run free. For Grace, this moment was strange. She had never been surrounded by such comfort, nor seen Jonathan in a context other than that of a powerful businessman. Yet, watching him smile at his daughter, she discovered another face, that of an attentive father, capable of humor and gentleness. "Emily is incredibly endearing," Jonathan said softly. "I don't know how I lived without that laugh for so long." Grace smiled, a little embarrassed, but sincerely. "She's so lucky to have you. You're an incredible father." Their hands brushed as they exchanged glances. A shiver passed between them, but neither spoke. The silence was comfortable, filled with mutual understanding and respect. Emily ran toward them with a ball in her hands, and Jonathan leaned down to congratulate her. Grace watched him, fascinated by the simplicity and humanity of the man behind the suit and the millions. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged, even in this world so far removed from her own. "You know," Jonathan said after a moment, "I don't want you to think I'm pushing you into something. I just want to share these moments with you and Emily. If that's okay with you." Grace looked at her daughter, then at Jonathan. A gentle warmth rose within her. "I want to try," she whispered. "But I want to make sure it's sincere, for Emily, and for me." Jonathan nodded with an understanding smile. "Nothing is more sincere than what I feel for you both." And in that moment, in that small Manhattan park, far from the luxury and noise of the city, a bond was formed between them. Not a bond based on money or status, but on trust, compassion, and mutual respect. Emily, happy, ran to cuddle up in Grace's arms, while Jonathan watched them, his heart lighter than it had been in years. That day, a millionaire and a simple waitress began writing the first chapter of a story that would transcend social barriers and prejudices, guided by the power of love and humanity.